Okay, all right, so we are continuing our study in Old Testament survey, and we have finished the Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, and we have finished what are known as the former prophets, which is Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Now we've been following the English ordering, so we've also done Chronicles, and we've done Song of Solomon, and Proverbs, and others, but when it comes to the sort of Hebrew ordering, which I'm going to talk about today when I talk about the latter prophets, we're entering a new kind of section. So in the same way that we sort of did a survey of the whole Old Testament and the Torah, and we did a survey of the wisdom literature, we're going to do a survey today of the prophets. My goal would be to be able to do Isaiah all next week. I usually teach it in two weeks. I'm going to try to do it in one if possible. I don't know what, I'll be gone. I'll be in Indiana the following week, so we'll have to figure out whether you pick up Jeremiah or we just wait till I return and do something else. But and then we'll do Ezekiel. We'll do Lamentations with Jeremiah. We'll do Ezekiel, and then we'll spend 2 or 3 weeks on what are called the 12. I'll refer to them as the minor prophets here one time today, but that'll be the last time we're allowed to use that term this study, because I'm not a fan of that term. So we'll call them the 12 otherwise. So that's what we'll do for our study. So talking about the latter prophets, it is just 4, just like there were 4 Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings are the 4 former prophets. There are 4 latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. And you think about a good way, I think their names are good. The former prophets, they spoke, they wrote, and they talked about the things that had happened, the former events, and explained why Israel had gone into exile, and explained what God had thought about their history, and explained what the nation did and didn't do in their relationship with God. The latter prophets all look towards latter events, the things that happen in the latter days. And they pick up, because remember, Kings was the end of the former prophets. Remember how we talked about how the narrator or the author made it seem like it was time for another covenant renewal, but God didn't do that, remember? As Elijah and Elisha came on the scene, there was no covenant renewal, and then the nations were judged and exiled. And it was kind of like a real tragedy, a real tragic end of the story. Well, the latter prophets are going to pick up there, and they're going to talk about the future things, how that wasn't the end of the story, that there is an end and a hope that's coming. And that's what the latter prophets are going to speak to, is that those latter days. I'll go ahead and tell you, and I'll develop this more later, but they each are going to take a different aspect of that. Isaiah is going to focus specifically on the who, question of who is going to be involved in that. Jeremiah is going to talk about what's going to be done in the latter days. Ezekiel is going to talk about where it's going to happen. And the 12 are going to pick up the story of when is this going to happen. So it's similar to, you think about the Gospels. People say, we have 4 Gospels that are all talking about the similar events, but they all have a different angle. With Matthew being Jesus pictured as the king of the Jews, and really being an evangelistic letter to unbelieving Jews. You had Mark, which is Jesus as a servant, not a king, and also to unbelievers, but Gentiles in this case. Luke pictured Jesus as a man, a human, and was written to Gentile believers. And John pictures Jesus as divine and is written primarily to Jewish believers. So in the same way, we've got 4 latter prophets all talking about the same future events, but taking different aspects. Now, I would venture to say, I think we'd all agree with this, if you took the kind of just some divisions of the Bible, you can divide it many different ways, but if you took, call it the Torah, let's just say the former prophets, the latter prophets, the writings, the Gospels, Acts, and the epistles, that probably, I would say, if we ask everybody, tell me which of those you know the least about and is the hardest, I think everybody would say that's probably the prophets, the latter prophets. I mean, even the former prophets are story, the epistles are letters, we understand them, Acts and the Gospels are story, most of the Torah is story. It's very difficult when we come to the latter prophets. And I'm going to talk a good bit about that here in just a second, about why that is. But before I do so, I just want to start an introduction on, these aren't the first prophets. So even though in our English Bible we talk about the prophets, there are many prophets before them. So we already mentioned the former prophets. Those were categorized as prophecy in the Hebrew canon. But even go further back, there were prophets who spoke about things to come way back, way before the latter and former prophets. What are some examples of those? Who are some people, in the first 5 books of the Bible that spoke about things to come? Moses is the biggest example of that. So if we just look briefly at Deuteronomy 30, I don't want to spend a long time here. I won't read all 10 verses because this is just kind of set up, but Moses is going to give the entire framework, the entire prophetic framework that the latter prophets are going to fill in with details of who, what, where, and when. But Moses gives the entire framework for what's going to happen to Israel early in their history. He says in Deuteronomy 30, "It shall be when all of these things have come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind in all the nations where Yahweh your God has banished you." So Moses already said, you're going to get banished. You're going to do wrong. You're going to be banished into exile. You're going to remember when you're in exile. "And you return to Yahweh your God and obey him with all your heart and soul, according to all that I command you today, you and your sons. Then Yahweh will restore you from captivity and have compassion on you and will gather you again from all the peoples where Yahweh your God has scattered you." So Moses, early on, 1,000 years before, more than 1,000 years before, predicted what's going to happen. So you had Moses, but there were prophets before him that talked about the future. Who else? Moses is just the 4th as an example. Who before Moses even talked about? So Abraham, I'll show him in just a second. So in what way did Abraham do that? I don't have him listed in this because primarily Abraham was given revelation about how he was going to be a blessing to the nations and all. Yes, that's right. Who else? Jacob. Jacob's the next example I can think of. Jacob had, there's a whole chapter there in Genesis 49 where he's on his deathbed and he talks about what's going to happen to each of his sons, way out into the future. How about even before Jacob? Noah. So Noah prophesied at least of more recent or more modern events when he said God's going to send a flood. He did prophesy in that sense, but talking about latter events, things that were going to happen. The other 2 are not maybe that clear. I have Job, and I know Job, we said, may have been written in the time of Solomon, but we believe Job, the patriarch, lived earlier, and he talked about how he knew that though he died in his flesh, he would be able to see the Lord. He spoke of things that were going to come. I think the better example is Enoch, right? In the New Testament, when Jude, I think it's Jude, yes, Jude is talking about the false prophets that had infiltrated the church. Jude says, hey, Enoch prophesied about this, 7 generations from Adam. He talked about how this was going to happen. And so that's actually in an apocryphal writing, but again, the fact that it's in an apocryphal writing doesn't mean that Jude is saying the Apocrypha needs to be a part of our canon. It's just saying there was a true tradition of Enoch prophesying years ahead, and yeah, it's been carried down by oral tradition and eventually written down. But the fact is that Enoch, 7 generations from Adam, prophesied of things way to come. So the prophets are not the first to come on the scene and talk about things to come. This is something that happened previous to them. But this is where the bulk of it is. I mean, Moses gave a little bit of a structure of what was going to come. Enoch has a few prophecies. Jacob has 1 chapter. But here we're going to get a massive bulk that's almost completely future-looking in nature. Now, they're really hard, right? We talked about how they're the hardest of those maybe 7 sections for us to understand. And I'm going to talk about reasons why. I want to talk about just big picture the reason I think that they're hard. And I want to ask the question, what is the purpose of prophecy?
To show that God knows what he's doing?
Yeah, I think you got it first answer. I think the purpose of prophecy is to glorify God by showing his omniscience, is my argument. So a good analogy would be the Exodus. You think about the Exodus. What was the point of the Exodus?
To demonstrate God's power and refute the false gods of Egypt.
That's right. It was to show God's mighty hand. Now, in a real sense, the point of the Exodus was to get them out of Egypt. And in a real sense, the point of prophecy is to reveal something that's coming. But there's something bigger at stake, and that is, in both of those cases, is to magnify God. Now, think about the Exodus. You know, God came and began to show his mighty hand. And what did the Egyptians do early on?
They tried to duplicate his power.
And not only did they try, they did, right? They duplicated his power, right? I mean, I don't understand. I've seen some really cool magic, you know, in sleight of hand and things, and they did some pretty neat tricks, the wise, you know, magicians of Egypt. But ultimately, they got to a point where they just said, our tricks have run out. Like, this has got to be something divine. We can't do this. Okay? And prophecy is that same way, where we have our own sages and folks, you know, that will make predictions of the future, or you know, find ways to say things about the future. But God is going to prophesy things in a way that no one can take the glory. In the same way that he showed his power in the Exodus in a way that no one could match, he in prophecy is going to show his omniscience in a way that no one can match. So how does he do that? Well, let's read a little bit here in Isaiah. Isaiah is the prince of the prophets, and so a lot of what we'll talk about when we talk about the difficulty of the prophets, and even now as we talk about the purpose of prophecy, is going to come from Isaiah. So turn in Isaiah to chapter 49. And I just want to show you first with a couple verses that this is the point of prophecy. And then I want to show how the implication of that for why it makes it hard to understand. Isaiah 49, we read verses 6 through 8. He says, "It is too small a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. I will also make you a light of the nations." Okay, hold on now. I wrote that down wrong because that's not my verse. I apologize. Give me 10 seconds. Oh, 44. I can't read my handwriting. 4s look like 9s if you don't draw them. Okay, we're going to do 44, 6 through 8. It didn't sound right. "Thus says Yahweh, the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, Yahweh of hosts, I am the first and I am the last, and there is no God besides me." So that's a significant claim, right? And he proved his power, the power of God, through the Exodus. Now, how's he going to prove it in this case? "Who is like me? Let him proclaim and declare it. Yes, let him recount it to me in order. From the time that I established the ancient nation, and let them declare to them the things that are coming and the events that are going to take place. Do not tremble and do not be afraid. Have I not long since announced it to you and declared it, and you are my witnesses? Is there any God besides me, or is there any other rock? I know of none." So here God's saying, there's nobody else. I'm the only God, and here's how I can show it to you. I announce things ahead of time before they come to pass. And who can do that? Let's look at 42, 8 through 9 as one more example before I get to the implication of this and why it makes it hard. 42, 8 through 9. "I am Yahweh, that is my name. I will not give my glory to another, nor my praise to graven images. Behold, the former things have come to pass. Now I declare new things. Before they spring forth, I proclaim them to you." So again, God in his omniscience is showing there's no one like him through prophecy. Now, the last one in Isaiah 43, 3 through 8, this is going to, so given that God states his uniqueness and his his identity on his ability to do this, and given that in the Exodus you had these sort of false miracles, false power, we're going to see that in prophecy as well, in future telling. Look at 43, 3 through 8. "For I am Yahweh your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I have given Egypt as your ransom, Cush and Seba in your place. Since you are precious in my sight, since you are honored and I love you, I will give other men in your place and other peoples in exchange for your life. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bring your offspring from the east and gather you from the west. I will say to the north, give them up, and to the south, do not hold them back. Bring my sons from afar and my daughters from the ends of the earth. Everyone who is called by my name, and whom I have created for my glory, whom I have formed, even whom I have made. Bring out people who are blind, even though they have eyes, and the deaf, even though they have ears." So my main point in quoting this is to say God is going to do things. He's going to pronounce things that no one could think ahead, that no one could think was going to happen. So in this case, it's that this nation is going to revive and come back. But look at verse 19. Behold, I will do something new. Now it will spring forth. Will you not be aware of it? I will even make a roadway in the wilderness, rivers in the desert. So God pronounces things that people would never dream would happen, new things that would happen. Because it's one thing to say, hey, this year Georgia's going to beat Georgia Tech in football, right? I mean, I might look like a prophet, but really that's not that hard to predict, right? But if you pronounce something new or different, or if you're able to hide something, and then when it's yes, like I would, if I could show that, then right? If you hide something, or if it's only clear after the fact, he knew that ahead of time, and he revealed it every time, I didn't realize it, then that's when you begin to see no one can mimic that, no one can fake that, and so that right there are two reasons why prophecy is hard, why the latter prophets are hard. One, because God is going to make plans that you wouldn't think about, you wouldn't dream about. Like the church itself was something not revealed. It was revealed enough. I mean, you can look back and say, oh yes. I mean, and Paul even quotes some of the prophets and what God's going to do with the Gentiles. But it just wasn't obvious. No one was expecting it, right? So that's one difficult thing, is God, in order to avoid pretenders, prophesies things that are new and different to show his omniscience. The other is, again, that he does it in a way that's not always on the surface until after it happens. We've talked about how oftentimes types and prophecies are more clear looking back than they are looking forward. Well, there's a point in that. It's to show God knew it all along. Even with him revealing it, we didn't see it. Let me give some examples that I have on my phone, so I just need to log in here for just a second. Where God shows it. You think about ways that God could, some risks God takes in putting out on paper things that are going to happen. One is that people will take credit. And who are some of the people that could take credit? The spokesmen themselves, right? They could take credit and say, I knew this was going to happen, right? And I could, and so God even prophesies in a way where the subject, the hearers, and the speakers all don't understand. Which is amazing when you think about it. So let me tell you what I mean by that. The subject. So Abraham received a prophecy. He was the subject of a prophecy we talked about. He's going to be a father of many nations. But Abraham had no clue how that was going to happen. Right? He was the subject of the prophecy, and he had no clue how it was going to happen. He even went to means to make it happen. They were not the right way. Right? Another example is Cyrus. Cyrus was the subject of a prophecy in Isaiah hundreds of years before he came on the scene. But Cyrus didn't know the Lord. He didn't know God. He didn't know he was being used as an instrument in that sense. Even hearers don't always understand the prophecies that they've been given. You think about the first followers of Christ and how Christ had to open their minds on the road to Emmaus to understand the things that had been written. They had heard him talk about his death and resurrection, but they didn't get it. He had predicted that it was going to happen, so they would know he was the Son of God, but they didn't understand until after the fact. And the most amazing part is even the prophets themselves, even the speakers, don't always understand. They can't take credit because they don't even understand what they're prophesying. So examples of that, Caiaphas, he spoke about what was going to happen, right? He spoke about how one man was going to need to die for the people. And being high priest, he prophesied, but he didn't know what he was saying. And then another example is the Old Testament prophets. The New Testament talks about how they searched their own writings to try to understand what the Spirit of Christ in them was foretelling. Mm-hmm. So all that to say that at a big picture, that's why I think the prophets are hard. Because this is a section of Scripture where God is showing his uniqueness and his omniscience. And we are limited in that. And one day, when all has come to pass, we're going to look at it and we're going to understand it a lot easier. But in the meantime, it's a little bit more difficult. And with things that are more difficult, there's risk and a reward here. Peter writes about how Paul wrote some things that were difficult, and that the ignorant twist them to their own destruction. And there are many people who come to the prophets and come with all kinds of schemes. There are lots of false religions that have built schemes on the prophets that don't come to pass and have ruined a lot of people. And so we have to be really careful. But there's a lot of really neat things here as well that will cause us to praise and glorify God for his omniscience if we study them carefully. So really high picture, that's why I think the prophets are difficult. Now let me talk about, just briefly, a lot less time, some other kind of really specific reasons why they are difficult. Okay, one is they use a very difficult vocabulary. I'm going to give examples of each of these, all from Isaiah, again, as sort of the prince of the prophets. They use a difficult vocabulary. So what do I mean by that? Well, Isaiah himself uses 2,200 different words. I don't mean total words. I don't mean like he used "and" 400 times and he used the 2,200 different words in the span of 66 chapters. That's 33 different per chapter. He uses many words that are used nowhere else, one time only, and used nowhere else. And it's not like the English language, where if somebody were to use a word in a sermon, you could at least go research it in a dictionary or in on TV or in other places like where it's being used. We don't have that many extant, which just means available Hebrew writings to be able to look and say, oh, okay, well, it's used this way in other contexts. This must be what this word means. I don't remember the total number. They're called hapax legomeni, which means a word that's only used once. And you just do the best you can from context, from the kind of root of the word and how it's related to other words. Isaiah uses tons of those. And so it's very difficult vocabulary. 238, there you go, words that are used nowhere else. Even that's 4 words a chapter, approximately, if my quick math is correct. Okay, so difficult vocabulary. They use very difficult imagery, the prophets do. Rahab, was it not, Rahab is not a common image that we use as modern English American people, and so we run into a lot of these images that are for us very foreign. Curds and honey. And if I'm looking for food to serve as an illustration, I don't think of curds and honey often. I guess honey, I would, but curds and honey is not a common thing that we use, and so it makes it difficult to understand what they're symbolizing if we don't understand the symbols. Difficult geography. So Isaiah 10, 28 through 34 list how the Assyrian king was coming to Jerusalem. And the path that he takes is important, and we don't understand any of those cities. It's not like he said, he started in Nashville and he went to Knoxville, he came through Kennesaw on his way to Atlanta. Like, okay, I think we could handle that, but this is difficult for us. Most of these we are not familiar with. And so as we read the prophets, we interact with this tough vocabulary, we interact with these odd images and these places we don't know anything about, and it makes it really hard for us to understand as we read. That's not all. The prophets are different in that they have almost a different hermeneutic in the sense of this. So if you're reading the former prophets, it's pretty straightforward. It's Israel did this, they broke the law, God decided to do this. Okay, we get it. Moses is, hey, here are the laws you need to take. The writings of the New Testament, don't complain, don't grumble or argue. Okay, I get it. Okay, well, the prophets, it gets very difficult. Like, here's a couple of examples. Isaiah 7:14 is this sign that's given to Ahaz in 700 years before Jesus was born. And it's a sign for Ahaz and in a way he needs to act. And yet Matthew comes along as an inspired apostle and says, hey, Isaiah prophesied of Jesus to be born of a virgin. And you're thinking, wow, that's interesting. Like, on the one hand, it was a sign to Ahaz. On the other hand, it was something that God was using to talk about Jesus many years later. And prophecy is hard like that. It's hard to understand exactly what's being referred to. Isaiah 61, Jesus took that and stood in the synagogue and read it. But he left off a verse. And if you look, he read the section that talked about his meek first coming, and he left out the part that talked about his powerful second coming. So that's fine. We can understand that. Jesus had 2 comings. But if you're reading in Isaiah, those things are put right together. And so the prophets, again, are very difficult to understand as you read them. Not just because of the vocabulary, symbolism, imagery, and geography, but because as you read them, you run into things like that. You run into difficulties where, again, God is writing it in a way that he can reveal his plan without, making it so that others can take credit for also knowing it. And then finally, and this is the last one I'll say, it's a difficult structure. It's difficult. They're not chronological. They're never chronological. That's not completely true. They have some chronological aspects to them, but they're generally not like the Exodus from Egypt, and then the stories of the kings, or the stories of the Acts of the Apostles, or the stories of God. There's a structure to them that isn't always obvious, and it makes it difficult. I'm going to put a quote up here by a pretty conservative scholar that, I mean, it's really interesting to hear what he has to say about the structure of the prophets. And I know we feel this, but he kind of says it straight out. What makes these books, he was talking about Jeremiah, but in general, what makes these books particularly, and one might say needlessly difficult, is the very manner of their arrangement, or to be more accurate, their apparent lack of arrangement. The reader who meets them for the first time is likely to be quite at a loss. All seems confusion. There's no narrative for him to follow, nor can he trace any logical progression running through them and binding their parts together into a coherent whole. No sooner has he grasped a line of thought. I mean, we've all been there, right? You read a portion, okay, I know what they're talking about here, I get this. But then you go on, especially Isaiah, you go a chapter later and you go, well, now I'm lost again. I don't really know why. No sooner has he grasped a line of thought and prided himself that he is following it tolerably well, then it breaks off and something quite different is being discussed. The impression he gains is one of extreme disarray, and one can scarcely blame him for concluding that he is reading a hopeless hodgepodge thrown together without any discernible principle of arrangement at all. Now, I don't know that John Bright believes this. Again, he's a pretty relatively conservative writer. I certainly don't believe it, but I do believe that's the feeling you get. It really does, when you read, you know, I've always joked, if I covered up one side of the page and let you read the other, I bet you couldn't predict what's on the next side of the page. It's very difficult because it does feel like the arrangement's tough to follow. But in reality, this is actually going to be what helps us the most. The structure is going to be what helps us the most, because there is a structure. It's not how we would structure it. But again, they were working under different circumstances. I've mentioned before, they didn't have Microsoft Word, and they didn't have unlimited resources to write, and they didn't have bold and underline and outline, right? I mean, they were writing on what they had. And so there is a structure there, and when you understand that structure, it's what really helps to get past the difficulty of the prophets. Okay, so I mentioned these Bible divisions. I've already talked about how, you know, I think that that's not the best way to divide it even. It's just the point again is I do think we struggle with these the most. And so, you know, I want to encourage us to not avoid them, because there's some rich things in there. Again, it's going to prove God's omniscience, and it's going to talk about the future. Everybody's interested in that. I also would encourage us to be careful, because again, a lot of bad things have come through misapplication of them, and I would encourage us to use what we can, especially structure, to try to overcome the difficulty. Okay, so the prophets in the English canon, we talked about how this is really kind of what we're following in this class, but we're as the prophets are in our Bible, they end the Old Testament, and they include Isaiah through Malachi, which also includes Daniel for us. So Daniel in the Hebrew Scriptures is not a prophet. He's in the writings, and that'll the purpose for that will become more clear as we get to the 12. But this is the prophets in the English canon. Okay, so let's put them up here. So there are what we call, and again, this is the last slide where we'll be allowed to use the term minor prophets. I'll explain why in just a second. But in our English canon, we have the major prophets. Lamentations usually comes with Jeremiah, and Daniel is included in the major prophets. And then we have the 12 so-called minor prophets. Now, again, in Hebrew, we're going to only have 4 prophets, 4 latter prophets. It's going to be Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and these are all one book, referred to as the 12. Now, when you hear about the minor prophets, everybody always, I appreciate this about them when they use that term, but I still don't agree with it. They'll say, hey, they're called the minor prophets, not because, what do they say? Not because they're unimportant, but because they're short. Because they're shorter, right? Okay, all right. Well, that's not true. So let me actually get past all this animation here. So they're not that much shorter. So again, it's important to see them as one book. The 12 are one book. And when you put them next to Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, they actually have more chapters than any of the other 3 and are very similar in length.
But when people say that, they're talking about the individual books.
That's right. So that's why I want to change that terminology, because I think of the prophets are the hardest section for us in Scripture, and the minor prophets are the hardest of the prophets, probably, or at least what we know the least about. At least we feel tolerably familiar with Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. We can tell you a few things about them. I was quizzing them earlier about what they knew about Isaiah. I mean, Ezekiel, you could say, yeah, I know he leaves the temple, and there's the vision of the wheels, and there's the new temple that's talked about at the end. And Jeremiah, that's the new covenant, right? And he gets thrown into a well. I mean, the 12 are the minor people. I don't know. I guess Hosea's in there. He married somebody. I don't know much else. Jonah. But they're one book, and I would say they're the climax, to be honest, of these four. So they're going to be it's going to be the climax of the four have a story. We're going to talk about that, just like the former prophets had a story, and the story was of the renewing of covenant until Kings, when the covenant was no longer going to be renewed. The 12 are going to, the latter prophets all are a unit. As I mentioned, they're going to talk about who is going to bring the hope of Israel, who's going to bring restoration, what is going to be the means of that, where is it going to be, and when is it going to be. And in the same way that King sort of ends on a twist, where as a reader you continue to see renewed covenants and you expect to see that again, and here comes Elijah and Elisha with all the elements that you expect to see in someone God's going to renew covenant with, and then out of nowhere God ends it. Similarly, there's going to be a twist when it comes to the 12. We're going to talk about what that is. And so I think they're a major part of the latter prophets. They're similar in length, so I think it's important to not call them the minor prophets. But it's okay if you say it. It won't bother me. Okay. Also, even in length, they cover a lot longer. So what we'll find is Isaiah is going to cover a certain part, and Jeremiah is going to cover a certain part, and then Ezekiel. But the 12 cover the entire part, both before and after. So they're very important books. Okay, so what's the overall really, really high level, what point do the latter prophets have? I've already sort of insinuated this, but essentially the Pentateuch is going to be the birth of the nation, the laws that govern them, the priesthood and temple that governs them, and the Mosaic covenant particularly. I mean, the Noahic covenant's there, the Abrahamic covenant's there, but the Mosaic covenant is how they operate as a nation. Then the former prophets are going to speak particularly about the fall of the nation and the Davidic covenant and how they're going to have a ruler that's going to be over them. And that's what we talked about in Samuel with the Davidic covenant. The main point of the latter prophets is to say the end of the story is not the end of the story. There is going to be another covenant, a new covenant, and here's what it's going to be like. Here's where it's going to be, when it's going to be, who it's going to be with, etc. And then finally the writings are going to come, and their purpose is going to be to help the waiting nation along the way. Daniel's going to come through and talk about details of exactly what's going to happen while they're waiting and exactly when it's going to be. And the Psalms and the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, they're going to allow that waiting remnant to know how to act, how to understand while they're waiting for God to do the final thing. Because that's where we're at. Moses only predicted one more thing, and we're awaiting that final thing, which is the full restoration of Israel. Okay, time period. So let me get the main one up there. So that's just some big events that would be helpful to sort of hang different things on, different episodes and books of the Bible to understand. So we've got all the way back to Abraham's birth, all the way to where Cyrus allows the exiles to return. Obviously, the Torah takes us all the way through Exodus and right after. The former prophets are going to take us from there, beyond the exile of Judah into Babylon and a little bit there into just before Cyrus allows the exiles to return. The latter prophets pick up the story and carry it further, and that's what we're going to focus on here. There's four big events that they're kind of grouped around. The four big events are the exile of the northern kingdom, the exile of the southern kingdom, and then in between those, there's a massive and a major event that's very important to the latter prophets, and that is when Assyria goes to destroy the southern kingdom and God spares them. That's a very important prophecy that's going to be picked up by Isaiah and Micah. And then lastly, the return after Cyrus allowed them. And so this is where you would put each of those latter prophets, where they fit around those four major events. Joel and Obadiah aren't dated. I believe they're early. I believe they're some of the earliest prophecies. Most people think, or a lot of people think they're later. When we get to those books, we'll talk about them. I think the 12 are mostly chronological. But you'll see the 12, they start early here and they end all the way here. They cover a much longer span than even Isaiah, Jeremiah, or Ezekiel. Okay, and couple more things, and then we'll be done. Just kind of where they prophesied, and just a few kind of key texts from them. Then I'll go ahead and reiterate I'll explain a little bit more about the who, what, where, when, and then we'll be done. And we'll cover Isaiah next week. So Hosea, as the first, the head of the 12, he prophesied to the northern kingdom, and he talked about how, and many of the 12, the first couple books of the 12 talk about this, how they're going to fall, but how Jerusalem is not. So God's going to have compassion on Judah and Jerusalem, but he's not going to have any more compassion on the northern tribes. And so Hosea was an example of that. So they prophesied right around that fall of Israel. And then Isaiah comes in, and as I mentioned, 701, which is when the Assyrians came to defeat Jerusalem. That's a very important prophecy. And Isaiah bases his book around that and how the king is going to respond in that crisis. So God promises to deliver the king from the hand of the king of Assyria, and yet says that at the same time Babylon is going to come and I'm not going to deliver you from Babylon. Jeremiah picks up that story right around the time of Babylon destroying them. He prophesies of the fall of Judah, and then shortly after shares with them, here's how you need to act now that you're in Babylon. Just submit to them. It's going to be 70 years. Unpack your bags. Try to prosper the city of Babylon. You're going to be there. And so that's what Jeremiah has, both the message before and after. I won't read those. And then Ezekiel picks up, and he's primarily ministering to the folks in exile. And his message is that God is going to be there with them in exile, but then he's going to return them back. And he's going to go back, and they're going to come back to the land. He's going to revive them in the land. They're even going to build a temple in the land. And I don't have up here, but the last of the latter prophets are going to be back, no longer prophesying in the land, and prophesying of times to come after Cyrus and after the rebuilding, or at least the initial rebuilding of the temple. I won't spend a lot of time on this. I just want to point out again that they're going to be, they follow the Torah and the former prophets, and they use those and they build on those. And so they'll talk about you'll see references to the Ten Commandments, and you'll see references. This is another reference where Jeremiah is clearly talking about the Ten Commandments: steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, offer sacrifices, bail. Those are all directly from the Ten Commandments. You'll see, clearly when he talks about a new covenant, they're referencing the fact that God had made all the previous covenants with Israel. So you see that they're continuing to build on what was in the former prophets. And then you'll see the writings are going to take what is in the former prophets, and they're going to build upon them. And Daniel's the best example of this, where he explains exactly, how long, what he's looking at Jeremiah. He recognizes it's been 70 years. And he's saying, hey, I'm ready now, God. It's been 70 years. You promised to act. And that's the basis of his prayer. I just want to briefly talk about those four things real quickly. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. In the 12. I don't have slides on this, but I just want to share just briefly what I mean by who, what, where, and when. So Isaiah is going to start. Isaiah, is going to be around that Assyria coming to destroy Jerusalem, and there's going to be deliverance. And there's going to be fabulous deliverance, but because, as we'll see, Hezekiah wasn't truly faithful to the Lord in that, he's not the righteous king that's going to bring about the ultimate deliverance of Israel, and Babylon is going to come. And in the second half of Isaiah are all the prophecies about how God is going to bring hope to the nation, though, and he's going to do it through there's three sections in that latter half of Isaiah. There's a section that really focuses on Cyrus. He's going to be the one that God raises up to help bring them back. Then there's going to be a suffering servant, right, that's going to deal with the sin of the people. And then there's going to be God himself is going to come and is going to deliver them. And we'll talk about that in Isaiah next week. So that's where we really talk about Isaiah focusing on who's going to bring about this future hope of Israel. Jeremiah, when I say talks about what, in particular, that he's going to bring a new covenant. And Jeremiah focuses wholly his prophecy on what God's going to do and how he's going to bring it about. Because if you look back, every covenant he's made before has not worked because there's always failure. And so he's going to really focus on what God's going to do to make that happen, how he's going to circumcise their heart, how the new covenant's going to be different than the covenant. It'll be similar, but it'll be different, and then it's going to circumcise their hearts and give them his Spirit. When I talk about where in Ezekiel, Ezekiel has two aspects just like Isaiah. One, he's going to tell the people, he's going to say, I'm going to be with you in exile. It's going to be as if I have a sanctuary with you in exile. I'm going to dwell with you. I'm going to go into exile with you, as it were. So he talks about that, but a big part of Ezekiel's prophecy is that he is going to establish them back in the nation. There's going to be a future for Israel in the land. And so where is very important. And then finally, when it comes to the 12, when I mention when, what the 12 are going to contribute is that the day of the Lord, which everyone would have looked to and said that was when Judah was destroyed by Babylon, actually the day of the Lord is future. And so the timetable may be a little different than people are expecting. Daniel is going to take that and recognize, he's going to get direct revelation from God to find out, actually it is. It's not just 70 years. There's another 7 times 70 after that that's going to come. And the 12 are going to be really written around the fact that there's still yet more judgment to come. And the time is not yet there. And so again, when you see that and you see the messianic fervor in the New Testament, and you see the fact that it didn't turn out like Israel was expecting, and instead they were judged again by Rome this time, that's something that God had already predicted ahead of time in the 12 and in the latter prophets. So again, it's not clear. You have to really, it's easier for me to say that and study now and see that than it would have been if I were a Maccabean, living in the intertestamental period. But it's clear enough now as we see, and we'll look at how we can learn that from the 12 when we get there. Okay. Let's pray.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So if I understood what you said correctly, the 12 deal more with ultimate restoration of Israel. Is that the way you said that? Or?
So I think that what I would say, I don't know, I would say that they really add to, so all of them are taking Moses' guideline and they're adding detail to it. And in particular, the 12 are helping to understand when it's going to be.
When it's going to be. So I'm curious, particularly with Jonah, how that fits in. He seems different to me in a lot of ways from the rest of the 12 and their major themes. The message there ultimately is that God's concerned about the Assyrians and the Gentiles, and it's kind of a lesson to Israel that they've become too self-centered. How does Jonah fit in with the rest of the 12, or should I just wait till we get there?
No, that's good. So we should wait in one sense, but it's a good question that, like, to me, you can't, they're meant to, like, here's an example. Zechariah and Malachi have overlapping structure. Like, they're meant to be, even the last three, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, are a section themselves within the 12 that overlap books. And so it's hard to me, I think it's helpful, but it's hard to just study one book in the 12 because Jonah has a message that contributes to the whole. And so it is hard to understand. Like, just take Jonah by itself, it's not going to talk about the when of the final restoration. Okay. But you put it in the whole of the 12, and it's going to, there's going to be a point that the overall author, whoever that is at least God. But if there was another, I don't know if God orchestrated 12 individual prophecies and put them together, or if there was an editor, I don't know how that happened. But whoever, I'll just say God, the Holy Spirit, used Jonah and his message to be a part of the overall message of the 12. And in that case, it is going to be around, Israel's failure. So there'll be another, Obadiah is an example. Obadiah is going to be getting on to Edom for their lack of concern for other humans, in particular their brothers, because Esau and Jacob were brothers. And then Israel's going to do the exact same. They have no compassion on the people in Nineveh, despite the fact that they don't even recognize their left from their right. And so those two even go together to help try to bring about conviction on what Israel's doing wrong in that regard.
I think Anna might have a window.
Okay. You just putting your hand on his shoulder. All right, let me pray. And again, we'll try to do Isaiah in one if we can. We'll definitely do Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, each of those in one. The 12, because it is 12 individual that we have to work through, it may take 2, it may take 3 weeks to do those. But all right, let's pray. God, thank you for revealing to us your omniscience, and God, I ask that you'd give us humility to not scorn or mock or deride you when we don't understand. Many times it's because, Father, only with time is it obvious that you did know what you were talking about the whole time. And it just shows, Father, that you're not only able to know it, you're able to reveal it in a way that shows our limitations and shows your glory. Help us to trust you. Help us not to give up or lose heart. It is hard, and it's the glory of kings to search out things. It's our glory, Father, to study and understand. Help us to be careful and not say more than is written or go off track or anything like that, Lord. Help us to have wisdom and understand what you've given and even know what our limitations are. But God, I praise you for your omniscience. I praise you that as powerful as you were in the Exodus, that's how knowledgeable you are. You know everything. You know things that have already happened that we don't know because they weren't written down. You know things that are happening right now that we don't know because we're limited to where we are. And you know what's going to happen in the future. There's nothing hidden from your sight, even though there's so much hidden from us. But you've revealed enough, and we don't have to be afraid because we know you're good. And it's just a matter of trust and growth and learning and knowing that whatever you do is for our good. Even tough things, you'll work all things out for our good. Thank you for revealing that so that we can trust you. Help us to walk in a manner worthy of that, including not complaining. In Jesus' name, amen.